Most men believe that communication is primarily about what is said, and they place enormous importance on choosing the right words, explaining intentions clearly, and avoiding misunderstandings. From their perspective, words are tools that create clarity, resolve conflict, and demonstrate honesty. If something goes wrong, they assume the problem lies in insufficient explanation or poor phrasing. This belief is reinforced by education, professional life, and social norms that reward verbal clarity and articulation. However, in relationships, words carry far less weight than attention. Attention is not what a man says, but where his focus rests and how stable that focus feels. A man may speak calmly and reasonably, yet communicate insecurity if his attention is reactive, restless, or dependent on response. Conversely, a man may say very little and still communicate confidence if his attention is grounded and self-directed. Women are highly sensitive to this distinction, not because they consciously analyze it, but because attention signals priority, stability, and internal balance. When a man's attention constantly adjusts to emotional shifts, seeks reassurance, or attempts to manage reactions, it communicates uncertainty regardless of how carefully he speaks. This is why many men feel that their words are ignored or misunderstood. The issue is not listening, it is alignment. Words are interpreted through the lens of attention. If attention feels unstable, words lose credibility. Until a man understands that attention precedes communication, he remains trapped in a pattern where he speaks more as his influence diminishes. Believing that clarity will restore connection when the real issue lies beneath language itself. Attention reveals itself most clearly, not when things are calm, but when emotional pressure appears. In moments of uncertainty, conflict, or silence, a man's attention either remains stable or begins to fracture. Many men believe they are composed because they control their words, but their attention tells a different story. It shifts rapidly, monitors reactions, anticipates responses, and searches for signs of approval or disapproval. This restless focus communicates far more than any sentence could. A woman senses when a man's attention is no longer anchored in himself, but is instead orbiting her emotional state. At that point, his words begin to sound hollow, regardless of how thoughtful or reasonable they are. He may explain his intentions clearly, yet the underlying signal is one of dependency rather than presence. This is why attempts to talk things through often fail during emotional tension. The man is speaking, but his attention is asking for permission. He is listening, but his listening is conditional, shaped by fear of loss or desire for reassurance. The woman experiences this not as care, but as pressure. She feels that she must respond in a certain way to stabilize him, and this quietly reverses the dynamic. The man believes he is being attentive, when in reality his attention has lost its grounding. True attentiveness is not reactive. It is steady. It does not chase emotional shifts or collapse under silence. When attention remains stable, words regain their weight. Until then, no amount of explanation can compensate for attention that has already revealed uncertainty. The moment attention becomes unstable, it begins to leak through behavior in ways a man rarely notices himself. He may believe he is calm, respectful, and measured, yet his attention betrays urgency through subtle cues. Over-explaining, checking reactions, filling silence, or adjusting his position based on emotional feedback. These behaviors do not come from malice or manipulation. They come from an internal need for resolution. The man wants to restore balance, to feel secure again, and he assumes that attentiveness and communication are the tools to achieve this. What he does not realize is that attention driven by the need for reassurance no longer communicates interest. It communicates dependence. The woman senses this shift immediately, not because she analyzes behavior, but because the emotional atmosphere changes. The interaction begins to feel monitored rather than shared, managed rather than experienced. Silence becomes uncomfortable, not because nothing is being said, but because attention is no longer relaxed. The man may interpret her withdrawal as a signal to engage more deeply, to ask questions, to clarify intentions. Each attempt, however, increases emotional pressure. The more he focuses on stabilizing the connection, the less stable it feels. This creates a paradox where attentiveness undermines attraction. True attention does not seek to control outcome. It allows space without anxiety and presence without demand. When a man's attention remains anchored in his own center, it communicates self-sufficiency and calm authority. When it drifts outward in search of validation, it erodes his influence regardless of how caring his words may be. This is why men who speak less but remain internally steady often have more impact than those who explain themselves perfectly. Attention shapes perception before words ever arrive. Until a man learns to stabilize his attention independently of emotional response, communication remains secondary, and effort continues to produce diminishing returns. When a man truly understands that attention carries more weight than words, his entire internal posture toward interaction begins to shift. He stops treating communication as a tool for fixing emotional states and starts recognizing it as a reflection of his own stability. Instead of reacting immediately to silence, uncertainty, or emotional distance, he allows those moments to exist without urgency. This does not come from indifference, but from internal grounding. He no longer feels compelled to fill space with explanations, reassurance, or carefully constructed statements designed to produce a specific response. His attention remains anchored in himself rather than orbiting the emotional state of the other person. This single change alters the emotional climate more than any conversation ever could. The woman no longer feels monitored, managed, or subtly pressured to respond in a particular way. She experiences space rather than demand, presence rather than pursuit. Attention that is stable does not chase confirmation or interpret every shift as a threat. It remains consistent regardless of emotional fluctuation, and this consistency restores credibility to whatever words are spoken. The man becomes less focused on being understood and more focused on remaining aligned with his own internal state. As a result, communication becomes simpler and less emotionally charged. Conflicts lose urgency because attention is no longer amplifying tension. Silence becomes neutral rather than threatening, and emotional shifts are observed rather than reacted to. This does not mean withdrawing, becoming cold, or suppressing feeling. It means remaining present without needing to control interpretation or outcome. Over time, this changes the structure of the relationship itself. Conversations feel lighter, disagreements feel less personal, and emotional exchanges stop revolving around reassurance. The man no longer chases clarity through speech because his attention already communicates stability. Words regain their proper role as tools rather than lifelines. They become effective again precisely because they are no longer burdened with the task of emotional regulation. This shift does not guarantee attraction, agreement, or permanence, but it removes the pattern where communication itself becomes a source of pressure and imbalance. By stabilizing attention, the man stops leaking uncertainty into interaction and begins influencing the emotional atmosphere without effort. And once attention is under control, words finally begin to function the way men always assumed they would, not as instruments of persuasion, but as natural expressions of presence.